See, we've still got some more folks coming in from the waiting room and joining us today. So we'll just give it a couple more minutes before we kick things off. Welcome, welcome, folks. It seems like we've got some representation from coast to coast to coast at the session today. It's wonderful. Thanks everyone for sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. So welcome to today's panel, Trust-Based Philanthropy, what it is and how we can support it together. My name is Devin Eyre. I'm the Vice President of Program Strategy and Business Development at Imagine Canada, and I'm just absolutely delighted to be your moderator for today's session. Today's session is being recorded, and in addition to being sent to all registrants after the session, it will also be available on Imagine Canada's YouTube page for sharing. We're really thrilled that for this conversation today, we have so many members of Imagine Canada participating, as well as companies from our PRISM corporate network. We're also really happy that we've got organizations that aren't members joining us today, as well as lots of representatives from both community organizations as well as grant makers. Now, today's panel is part of Imagine Canada's ongoing events that highlight insights and spotlight best practices and innovations in the nonprofit sector. In the new year, we'll be sharing lots more information on our upcoming events and how you can participate, whether you're a member or a non-member of Imagine Canada. But of course, if you do enjoy today's panel, we encourage you to consider becoming an Imagine Canada member. It's completely free for small and grassroots organizations. And although today's discussion really is an open forum, we will be offering a wonderful slate of capacity building sessions and events that specifically bring our membership network together. And we really look forward to sharing more about those in January. Now, today we'll be discussing trust-based philanthropy, a movement that reimagines the relationship between funders and equity-seeking communities. Now, while the term trust-based philanthropy can feel new, the practice itself isn't. For decades, community-led and grassroots organizations, especially those serving equity-seeking communities, have really emphasized relationships, reciprocity, and shared learning as the foundation of their work. Now, trust-based philanthropy aims to address the inherent power balances that exist between funders, nonprofits, and the communities that they serve. It is something that exists on a continuum. It's not a checklist or a one-size-fits-all solution, but really is a journey of continuous learning and, most importantly, relationship building. By providing nonprofits with the ability to plan, grow, and really innovate around emergent needs, it helps foster a much more healthier and resilient social impact sector. Now, the core principles of trust-based philanthropy include things like multi-year unrestricted funding, grant makers doing the homework on grantees and community, simplified paperwork, increased transparency among partners, soliciting a feedback both directions, and offering support beyond the check. Now, this contrasts with what we often see as traditional philanthropy structures of control, complex applications, strict reporting, and short-term funding cycles. While often designed with the intention of accountability, these can reinforce the power imbalances that we have and limit social innovation. Now, increasingly, trust-based philanthropy informs not only how foundations in Canada are operating, but also how broader policy might evolve to support much more flexible, equitable, and long-term funding models. In their sector, we've been really glad to see this year lots of calls to action to have corporate and philanthropic and government funders to commit to and demonstrate trust-based philanthropic funding models. And at Imagine Canada, we've done lots of work to influence how government and companies work to fund nonprofits. As an example, recently at Imagine Canada, we were really proud to release the PRISM practices, a framework that guides companies in their approach to nonprofit partnerships in Canada, and it aligns directly with trust-based principles. So reducing burdens, sharing knowledge, and creating stronger relationships. So today's conversation is really an opportunity to ask, how can we embed trust and stronger, mutually respectful relationships into our funding systems? I'm quite excited about the insights that are going to come out of today's dialogue, and I really want to thank our wonderful speakers for lending their tremendous expertise and experience to this ongoing conversation. But before we begin and dive in, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Imagine Canada's Staff, operations work, and network depend on traditional indigenous territories that provide us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community to live, work, and play. Our physical head office is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat nations. And we acknowledge that these lands are covered by Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We also acknowledge that these lands are still home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Now, personally, I'm joining you today from my home in Kitchener, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Chinatown, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Okay, so now I'm delighted to introduce to you our three panelists that we have today. We're going to start off with a quick round of introductions for each of them to tell you a little bit about who they are and what they do. And while they're speaking, we invite you, the audience, to keep an eye out in the chat where you're going to find resources throughout the introductions, but also throughout the whole webinar. And of course, you can also add your comments. As we go through the session today, you can also use the Q&A chat functions at the bottom of your screen in Zoom to ask questions as we go through. So let's get started with Naolo. So welcome. We're really glad to have you here. We're wondering if you can tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. My name is Naolo Charles. I'm calling today from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, a territory called Toronto. So I don't work for any foundation at this stage, but I've worked for 3 different foundations so far over a span of 10 years. I've also started and led several small social impact organizations. And I'm also passionate about history and storytelling. So this is the lens that I usually speak from. So it's a real honor to be here surrounded by colleagues that I have a lot of respect for. So thank you for having me today.
Great, thanks, Naolo. And Ikem, we're also pleased to have you as part of the discussion today. Can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Devin. It's good to be here and to share this conversation. My name is Ikem Opara. I work at the Rita Hall Foundation, where I lead some of our work in learning, civic engagement, and nationally. I live in the home of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, known as Pickering, and my curiosity, my experience as an immigrant to this land, and the work that I have been privileged to be able to do in both international development, youth education, and now accidentally, I like to say, in the philanthropic space, brings me to this conversation, and I'm looking forward to chatting with everyone.
Great, thanks, Ikem. And last but definitely not least, Emmanuel.
Thanks, Devon, and I'm so pleased to join my brothers, Ikem and Naolo. My name is Amanuel Melles Aman. I'm joining you today from Ottawa, originally working out of Toronto, Treaty 13. I hold the space for my colleagues at the Network for the Advancement of Black Community as the Executive Director. I've been kind of 32 years in the sector, half of it in various funding roles. And NAPSI and the work that NAPSI has been doing is mostly with government funders and philanthropy to try to create the conditions for systems transformation. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation and look forward to it.
Great, thanks, Aman. So in terms of how this will play out today, what we'll do is we'll start off with 2 rapid fire questions for our panelists, and then our panelists will weigh in on 1 question related to their expertise. Finally, we'll open the floor for audience questions before we wrap up. So we've got a lot to cover, and we want to make sure we hear from everyone. So without further ado, let's get started. So starting off, we want to hear from each of you, from your own experience, why trust-based philanthropy is so important. And Naolo, maybe we'll start with you, and then Ikem, you're on deck next.
Thank you so much for your question. So I don't know how rapid I'm going to be able to fire
That's okay.
this. But okay, so in West African mythology, we have something called the Sankofa bird that teaches us to look back in history to find the proper path into the future. So I want to do this today in this conversation by asking you a simple question. So have you ever wondered what was the ancient history of money? So there are 2 stories about that. The first one was made popular by someone called Adam Smith, who is known as the father of modern capitalism. And he says that Early humans used to live in a barter economy. So I give you something and you give me something in return. This story presents self-interest and market exchange as a foundation of human economy. The second story that you will hear if you speak more to historians and anthropologists says that there's almost no evidence of any human society that has ever functioned just on barter. Instead, before money existed the way we know it today, there used to be sophisticated systems of local trust networks. So I help you today because I trust that because of the relationships we have in our community, someone else will help me tomorrow. So trust, not trade, was the organizing principle. And so my 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 the point that I'm trying to make here today is that actually, if you look even at the language in modern finances, you will find a lot of words that seem to bring us back to that concept of trust. So the question that all of this raises in terms of philanthropy, in my opinion, is what if instead of thinking of trust as an emotion, an attitude, or some kind of privilege or the result of a skill, what if we thought of trust as more of a form of capital that must flow in communities before financial capital can actually flow effectively? So trust-based philanthropy to me is important because it brings that concept of trust to the surface and it forces us to think deeply about it. In my recent practice in philanthropy, one of the most important questions that I was always asking myself was, what impact will this investment have on trust capital in the community? And I think it's an important question. So another point that I want to bring today about the conversation on trust-based philanthropy is that many of the communities I've been trying to work with that we can call equity denied communities can be described as trust deserts. And I want to explain what I mean by that. These are communities that typically don't get trusted by the powerful institutions. Whether it is government, police services, or philanthropy itself. But these are also communities that sometimes, because of their history of being colonized communities, they've been exposed, they have endured centuries of colonial practices that are often about divide and conquer, and sometimes their internal trust networks have been eroded by these processes. So when you're in a community where it's hard for you to be trusted by the powers, and it's also a bit difficult for you to be fully trusted by your own peers, you're definitely in a trust desert, right? And so I think when we're thinking about this reality, it changes the way we think about the role of philanthropy in communities. I've been very focused in my practice on trying to create spaces of trust building in communities, just because of that reading and the way that I'm reading the importance of trust in communities. So now one key question that I think we have to reflect on is the question of how do you do trust-based philanthropy while also ensuring accountability? Because the problem is that if you don't have the proper accountability mechanisms, especially for racialized groups that are trust deserts like what I just described, then if you have just one bad apple, or even if you have one simple accusation made against a group, then it can have a dramatic impact on the trust that is allocated to entire communities for a long time because of all the biases we have in society, where we're putting everyone in the same bag. So all this, in my opinion, points to some really complex work. So trust-based philanthropy is extremely complex, but it is also very important. The last point I want to make is that I mentioned that the equity denied communities are trust deserts, but we also have to look at what's happening around the world right now, where we have a form of political movements that are promoting more distrust between communities, promoting more distrust in institutions. So the entire world now is becoming a trust desert. So in that context, I've always thought in every role I had in philanthropy that the most sacred thing that we can do with philanthropic roles is to try and promote more trust within communities. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. I completely disagree with everything that Naola has said. Just kidding. I said that just to be provocative in this moment. I agree with a lot of what you have said, Naolo. What I will add is the layer that I look at this from is not necessarily that there is an absence of trust or that trust is in short supply. I think some of what gets me interested in this conversation is the shifting dynamics about who gets trusted with what and why, under what circumstances, to what extent, how much of that trust is earned as a result of repeatable, predictable behavior, and how much of it is conferred upon that individual or group because of certain historical or identity markers or an expectation, an assumption that this person or this organization or this community is trustworthy. Trust is one of those things that we can and routinely give freely, even when it hasn't been earned. And there's risk in that, right? But that is the risk that we take on a daily basis as we navigate society as strangers from each other until we get to know each other and have built a basis of trust. So the distinction I see as well between trust and predictability is that there is a little bit of a positive sheen to the word trust. So I trust you to do something for me, with me, on my behalf, is different from I know you're going to behave in this predictable manner, right? There are a lot of examples and experiences of communities and individuals and organizations being routinely and repeatedly victimized. That is also a certain level of trust and confidence that you're going to have some kind of experience. But the trust that we're talking about here, and that my invitation in this conversation is that we're focused on that positive understanding of trust that, yes, comes with accountability. It comes with a responsibility to improving relationships and better outcomes. But owning in that conversation that it's not always earned. Why we trust people sometimes is, I know on this panel, we have 3 male presenting people having this conversation. What conversations do we have in society about what the image of a trustworthy leader is, right? I think there's a certain level of age or perception of age balanced with also level of vitality and strength that is not diminished by that age, right? There's a certain sort of patriarchal leaning towards a masculinity of this is a trusted leader sometimes. But I'm excited to be in a world and in a sector where we're challenging a lot of that right now, and understanding where we can find ways and pathways to trust communities and to trust actors that we don't yet have a strong relationship with. Philanthropy is a very big one in that sense, where that redistribution of capital, of wealth, typically has tended to flow amongst people who trust one another. And when those proxies for trust are sometimes stereotypical or unearned, then the trust can stay within a very tight circle, right? My expectation and what I'm seeing a little bit in our work is that we're puncturing some of that myth that you have to look or sound or move or be a certain way to be trusted or trustworthy, and that communities can trust organizations and funders to be good stewards of their faith in the work that we are doing in organizations without having earned it.
Thanks, Ikem. That's a really important consideration. So, Emmanuel, do you want to close us off with how you feel about the importance of trust-based philanthropy today and your perspective on it?
Thanks, Devon. I think the salient points were made by Naolo and Ikem. I think the only thing I would add is that if trust-based funding or trust-based philanthropy absolutely is important. When we focus on the word trust itself, trust is not a structure, it's a behavior. All the outputs of that behavior in terms of some of the things that in your intro you said, Devon, in terms of the types of funding structures and the streamlining, freeing up time and energy for grantees to be able to focus on innovation and solutions, they're byproduct of this behavior, yeah? And it takes two to tango. I think there are two players in this equation. There's the funder, the grantor, the grantee, or the community organization, or the implementer of the solutions. And so it's a relational concept. We're moving away from transactions. Now, let's be in a relationship. And in like any other relationship, there is messiness. There are ups and downs. And we can discuss maybe in the context of our conversation today, what makes it work, as opposed to why is it important? What makes trust-based philanthropy important? I think bottom line for me is that in the context of the work that NAPSI and other similar organizations do in the sector, where we're focusing on systems transformation, it's important that we recognize that our challenges in society, in the sector, in the country are complex, they are generational, they require collaborative solutions. And so at the end of the day, the ultimate outcome of trust-based funding or philanthropy is that we are better in terms of our innovation. We're closer to solutions that are practical. So society is better off because of this type of approach and shifting of the mindset in terms of funding. So we're all better off because of trust-based funding or philanthropy at the end of the day. But it's important to also explore how do you make it work beyond why is it important.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And playing off that idea of the two-way street, one of the concepts too at the heart of trust-based philanthropy is balancing power. So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about, on the ground, how you see power dynamics showing up in the funder and grantee relationships and what it can look like, what those behaviors look like to rebalance them. And Emmanuel, after you, maybe we'll go over to Ikem for your perspective on this one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Many moons ago or years ago, when I moved from senior roles in the sector to a funding role, I was pleasantly surprised that the funders don't necessarily have the solutions for communities. That the same issues and challenges that we face as society requires a collaborative engagement between grantees or organizations that are close to the problem in society and funders. So funders are indeed looking for being partners in solution with the grantees. So I think the first thing is we need to recognize that none of the two parties actually have absolute monopoly on the solutions. It's a tango play. So I think part of trust-based philanthropy or funding is there's no ifs and buts about that. We are redistributing power. And part of that redistribution of power is recognizing that lived experience matters. Traditional knowledge and indigenous systems and those knowledges matter. That people that are closer to the problem have practical solutions. So one of the things that, funders struggle is that they have, for the most of times, reduced funding to transaction. So if we move to relationship, then you start talking about this relationship is not actually limited to the flow of dollars and cents. There is much more than dollars and cents that's in play. There is joint thought leadership. There's joint learning. There is technical assistance and other things that funders and others bring to the table because of this relationship. So I think part of the challenge that communities have, and when I talked to, as I was talking yesterday to a leader in the community, a Black leader, why is this type of status quo getting in the way? Why is it persisting in terms of the relationship that we have with governments and funders? Part of that is that a lot of our community leaders are conditioned to think and function in this way. So part of the collective responsibility that we have is actually shift the mindset of our leaders and say, you're closer to the problem, you have some set of solutions that you bring to the table. But if you're in a relationship, before you ask for funding, if you bring data and evidence to the table and start a conversation about the scope of the challenge and the scope of solutions of shared understanding, then the work that you're doing and communities are better off. So I think it's a situation of really creating the opportunity for funders to learn more and listen more than prescribe, getting community leaders to understand that funders have a stake in this, that they could be actually engaged in a way that they become partners in solutions. So I'll stop there. And maybe there are a couple of other examples in the work that we have done that I could cite later on as evidence of this type of approach.
So following on hotly on the heels of that, I think that rebalancing also really includes, to Emmanuel's point, actively undoing some of that conditioning that has been put into the ecosystem and into the system by funder grantee behavior. As funders, we can't actually get anything done in community without the grantees. It doesn't matter how beautifully designed your granting program is, how much money you have to invest in community, unless an organization takes the risk of requesting you the funding you have available, demonstrates the vulnerability of opening up their books and their program design and telling you their story and their hopes and aspirations. There's nothing we as funders can do really to create the impact that we so loudly say that we want to create in community. So understanding that we need each other, it is an existential relationship that we need each other to be able to succeed in what we want to do first, and then actively undoing that work of watering down these interactions to transactions and fiscal responsibility alone, or grant monitoring alone, or reporting alone. I think really, to underscore Emmanuel's point, redefining the relationship in a way, some of the best, most enriching conversations I have had in community is when I talk to people, organization leaders, who are able to say to me, no, Ikem, I don't think you're the right funder for us. I don't think this is the right time for us to enter into a funding agreement with you. And they're able to explain, yes, we need the funding, and the need in community is great, and the work we want to do is great, but this has to work with some level of equity and a balance of both power, and that we both agree as actors in delivering on the project about where and how we want to get to that impact together. And, of course, there's the tactical things like how decisions are made, how grant programs are stood up, and being able to actually go into community and ask, what do you want to see as community members? You're the ones closest to both the challenges and the solutions. I long for a day, and I know that there's some foundations and funders who are doing this, where a lot of our work is playing a lot more of that listening role of understanding what community is challenged with and what the promises are in front of them, and then coming back to our desks and framing what we have heard as grant proposals for ourselves to determine and make investments into. Instead of the process we have right now, which is, we publicize a call and people, fit their story and their narrative as closely as they can to what we have said we are willing to fund. If we translated our own jargon into our own jargon so that we can understand ourselves as funders, after having spent time deeply understanding and looking at all of the decades of research that we have already done and has already been completed, and all of the things that community has told us for decades is the right way to intervene and the right way to mobilize capital to do things, I think those are ways that we can start to rebalance this power relationship a little bit better instead of doing yet another research project to learn more about what the needs and opportunities are. We can look back at the ones that we've already been talked to about by community, change some of the behaviors that community has pointed out are bottlenecks in moving capital into the spaces where those who are closest to both the challenges and opportunities have told us loud and clear, this is what we can do, and de-risk it for community. This is goes go back to the conversation around trust. It only seems like a really risky investment or grant when the perception or the level of trust is low, right? Same project, very similar outcomes, very similar activities. If the level of trust in that actor or grantee or community is high, then suddenly the risk matrix in that particular grant or that particular investment starts to look a lot prettier. That's the work that we need to do, I think, internally to sort of uncouple that power dynamic from the ways that we act and the way we show up in community.
Thank you, Ikem. Naola, anything you want to add when it comes to rebalancing the power relationships?
Yeah, so maybe one of the first points I want to think about is in terms of strategies. When you are a powerful funder, the priorities that you decide sometimes can act as magnets in communities. That's a power that funders have. You decide, okay, this is the priority, and then a few months later, there's a lot of organizations that are developing programs and initiatives to try and kind of meet that priority. And I think we have to be aware of that. I think most foundations are probably aware of that. But the consequence of this is you have community organizations that are in communities delivering really important work that beneficiaries really like, but they don't get the funding to be able to keep doing that. So then they shift their priorities based on the shifting priorities of philanthropy, right? And then what ends up happening is that you have less consistent delivery in the communities to try and solve problems. And then after a few years, we're looking at a particular community and we're like, we invested a couple of millions for this thing, but we're not realizing that it keeps shifting all the time. And so the reality is that the issues in the communities are not seasonal, like Elder Emmanuel mentioned before. They're the generational issues. So really, we can shift tactics and things like that, but there should be a consistency in the way that philanthropy tries to address some issues, right? So I think to me that's the first point. The second point, I think there's when I think about the practice and my recent experience, quite frankly, when you work in a powerful foundation, you end up wasting a lot of time for community organizations. They're trying to get funding from you. They have all these conversations, especially the ones that are not closer to power, right? And so we have to be aware of that as well. What are the ways that we can reduce the amount of time that organizations have to spend? And I think foundations are already thinking about that. Some foundations are simplifying their application processes to reduce the amount of time that grantees have to spend on it. So I think that's an important, because time matters, because that's time they can invest in being in a community, trying to resolve a problem in a community rather than applying for funding. The other power that I think we have, like philanthropy has sometimes, maybe without always knowing it, is how sometimes groups in communities are sometimes competing for the approval of philanthropy, even before you start talking to them. And that competition that can be created in communities can be very damaging. And especially if I bring back the concept of trust deserts that I mentioned before, in a community that's dealing with this, when people have to compete for funding, that's a huge problem. So for me, one of the practices I try to implement is a strategy that I can call maybe fund them all, right? So I look at ecosystem, maybe where foundation wants to be invested, or maybe I want to recommend that the foundation invests. And basically, I do my due diligence. I find the best players. I gather them, and okay, we're gonna fund the entire ecosystem. That creates abundance in the community, and it pushes people away from scarcity mindsets, right? So then people are more able to be able to work together. So I think um, these are some of the ways that we can kind of reduce the power. The last piece that I wanted to say is that powerful organizations in philanthropy, also powerful funders, maybe even including government, sometimes they also have a special power that they get to decide what the rules are, right? They get to decide what the rules are for, what is the problem that matters, what is the solution that matters, what is the risk that matter, what is the, you know, and so the way you can kind of counterbalance that is making sure that you're doing that in collaboration with the community groups, that that the rules that you're operating under are kind of guided by the perspectives of community groups. So I think that's fundamental, right? So
Great, thank you, Naolo. So one of the threads that are coming up a lot in your response is this idea of redefining relationships. And wondering, Emmanuel, I'll turn it to you, if you can talk a little bit about what equity-seeking organizations in particular can do to communicate their needs and realities more effectively to their funders.
Thanks, Devon. I think the if we're talking about trust-based funding or trust-based philanthropy, a relational issue or matter, then the encouragement that we need to give to community-based organizations and leaders is enter into that relationship early on, and don't reduce from the get-go the relationship to dollars and cents. Like the challenge that I see with a lot of our leaders is they go to funders with an ask focused on dollars rather than with a clarity around what it takes to tackle a particular problem in the community and what are the requisite dollars and cents that are needed based on data, evidence, and best practice and what have you. So if you get early on and you establish that relationship, as I said earlier on, trust being a behavior, then one of the things that would follow is that you don't have to wait until your reporting timelines are due. In those check-ins that you do, if you have that relationship, that you open the possibility to have those type of candid conversations that allow you to say, "Hey, this is what we have proposed, but these are new challenges that have emerged in the community that we want to talk to you about." So if you bring the funder as a partner in the solution and invite them to actually offer their insight and expertise, their networks, their technical assistance, and other ways to work with you, that's one way of looking at that. The other thing is it's very important for coming to the table with the capacity to tell stories, to bring the community voice, yeah, and to be able to say, here's what we're hearing on the ground that we're working on. I always, when I talk to leaders, I say, like, know your locus of control. What is that you can and you cannot control? And related to that is what is non-negotiable for you? When you go to engage funders, whether they are foundations or governments, what is that you cannot do in terms of delivering results for community? Because there are certain things that are not negotiable in terms of some things that are important to communities, including, trying to solve $100 problems with $10 funding, reacting to opportunities that don't make sense. So I think that's why we need to create capacity in our leaders to really have, with courage and conviction, the conversation with funders and foundations about what it takes to bring solutions to community. And my long journey in the sector tells me that we're always trying to tweak at the edges of the problem. If we try to actually around the table bring all the actors that have an influence in the solution for our communities, housing, mental health, unemployment, justice, all these big isms that societies face, we quickly realize that even the best funded organization cannot deliver solutions. So it's about bringing the collaborative space. And that's why I say, what's your contribution to that? What's your locus of control to that solution? And going with that sense of humility and courage to be able to say, hey, we need the team here, whether it's funders, governments, community leaders, private sector, and so on, working together. The other thing that I would also encourage community groups in this conversation is we have to help leaders to reframe capacity as a strategic investment of funders and governments. Often, people are reducing capacity and capacity building to a lot of noise, training and workshopping and so on. But the first principle of capacity is actually investing in people, the people that do the work. It's investing in the technology that people need. It's investing in the self-care and mental health of the people that are doing the work. So let's not be too limited in our understanding and implementation of capacity and capacity building. It's an instrument that is worth investing on because it delivers solutions. So there are a few things that I think our community leaders and organizations can do differently. Also recognize that they're the other side of the equation in this trust relationship. As I said earlier on, it takes two to tango. So what is that they need to do introspectively? The last comment I would make is systemic challenges, which requires collaborative solutions, they require a collective voice. And then I think Black leaders and racialized community leaders and other leaders in community, they need to really foster this idea of network leadership, system leadership, that we need to really come closer to the systemic solution for the systemic problems. And when we have that collective voice, then it's easier for funders and government to see this as a systemic approach, work in investing the requisite resources that are needed. Those are some of the points that come to mind, Devon, when I think about your question.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And yeah, I think that's all about, again, moving to that frame of abundance versus competition and staying on that theme of systemic changes. Naolo, I've got a question for you now. And you were speaking earlier about really focusing on generational change in communities versus seasonal trends. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what are the systemic and long-term changes you think philanthropic institutions need to adopt to make these trust-based approaches much more sustainable as opposed to trend-driven.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think I don't really want to repeat myself, but I'm gonna just highlight what the recommendations I would, what I would recommend. The first recommendation is really about strategic timelines. I think we tend to think in maybe 4 or 5 years sometimes, but I believe that foundations have an opportunity more than many other organizations to think even more long term. So I'm looking at, for instance, the strategy that was developed by the City of Toronto. I believe is their combating anti-Black racism strategy, and they built that strategy for 25 years. And I think that's a really good practice because, as people before me said, many of these issues are generational issues. So if you're planning for 4 years, 5 years, it's not enough. So you can have like a 25-year plan, even more if you can, and then you kind of report on that every few years, or you track on that every few years. That protects you from just being following trends. The second recommendation, and I think a lot of us mentioned that before because it's fundamental to this concept of a trust-based philanthropy, is that you build your strategies from a place of lived experience, not from a technical analysis from your experts, not just from your own opinions in your organization, not from public opinion, because public opinion shifts all the time. If you just look at the public sentiment on immigration in Canada, you will see how this has been shifting in over several decades, how that shifted. So we can't have strategies that are based on that. So we have to have strategies that are based on lived experience. I want to give you an example. So recently, I was involved in some projects with some community land trust in Nova Scotia, and I went to the conference of the community land trust network there. And one of the partners, she was speaking to the audience, and she said, "Everyone is talking about the housing crisis right now, but in our communities, we've been having a housing crisis for decades, if not centuries." And I think it's important to hear these voices because what it shows is that if you have a strategy that is based on the lived experience of the most marginalized communities, you will never be following the trends because you will always have a long-term vision and strategy that's based on lived experience. Now, when it comes to lived experience, the nuance I would like to offer is that I think there's probably two types of lived experience. So you have the lived experience of maybe what we can call frontline lived experience of people who are experiencing the issues and that are on the ground. You can talk to them and you can learn from them. And then you can have the what we can call the systems lived experience that you can get a little bit more if you talk to the experts from the community. And I'm not saying that the people on the ground won't be able to tell you that, some of them will. But if you speak to the experts from the community, they're going to give you a historical analysis, systems analysis to better understand the realities and why these things happen. This is what I personally did, and I mean, Elder Emmanuel was there when I started an initiative there was a crisis about African migrants in Toronto, and I reached out to the leaders I saw that were on the front line of this issue. And then, speaking to leaders that were on the front line, I heard something, and then speaking to Emmanuel that is here, who's a system thinker from the community, was able to explain something else. So that allows you to be able to have a fulsome understanding of a problem in a community that maybe you don't fully understand, right? So the other point that I wanted to make is that um, one of the best ways to actually develop systems change practices in foundations is by making sure that you're doing that in partnership with the groups, right? As Emmanuel has said, you think of the relationship with the community groups as a partnership building relationship where their expertise matters as well. So it's not just the expertise that we have in philanthropy that matters. So I'm going to end there.
Thanks so much, Naolo. And so last question, I think, before we head over to the questions coming in from the audience, because I see there's quite a few. Our last questions for Ikem. So we've been talking a lot about the hows of trust-based philanthropy and what it looks like, but I'm wondering a little bit for folks that are skeptical of the why and should they. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how boards and senior leadership and staff can align around trust-based philanthropy, especially when there might be an organization that has a lot of risk aversion or skepticism around some of these concepts.
To be blunt, I think the first thing is to educate yourself better about the realities of the communities and the realities of the issues that you in your letters patent you said you were committing to solving and addressing. Educate yourself about how the communities that you work on behalf of, the communities that you fundraise to create impact for, are experiencing and navigating life and navigating climate change and economic uncertainty and policy changes. And if you are not constantly and consistently educating yourself of those realities, you will lose any credibility you have in building the relationships with those communities, and you will become quickly out of touch with the right tactical moves to deal with things in the present. And you will also lose the vision to be able to do what both Naolo and Emmanuel have talked about, which is long-term planning on a generational scale of what this issue today could look like in 7 generations. If we do X, if we do X plus Y or if we do nothing, right? Yes, we're not, I think there's a lot of hubris in the sector, but we're not that arrogant to believe that we are the lever that changes everything. But if you've done a good job of understanding your organization's mission and carving out that locus of control Emmanuel talks about, you know what you want to and can and have chosen to impact. It'll be irresponsible not to educate yourself actively and constantly and be willing to challenge what you've learned on an ongoing basis so you can course correct, you can adjust your mission parameters, and more importantly, adjust the metrics by which you are measuring the success of your mission because you're getting constant feedback from, most importantly, the people who you are doing this on behalf of. I think that's a through line for staff, board members, fundraisers, donors, anybody who is involved in this sector. Particularly, we talk about the fact that we do this because it means something to us. We do this for social impact on social good. It's not just in French, they say, c'est pas juste un job. You're not just doing it because it's the work, right? You're doing it because there's a greater meaning to it. So I think it is irresponsible not to stay constantly connected to the source of that meaning and refresh your understanding of what that means for your work.
And briefly, Devon, just to complement what Ikem has really elaborated well, it's important that foundations intentionally become places of learning. So building a culture of learning, especially at the board table, supported by staff, is critically important. If learning is infused within the pillar, if you want, or the structure of the foundation from board to operations, then in that space of learning, foundations actually discover many new approaches and new thinking. I sit on the board of a new bold foundation called the Definity Foundation that intentionally actually goes out and visits grantees and learns and has an intentional learning framework that guides its practice. I remember 3 or so years ago, we were part of a community foundation's innovation exchange learning trip to London, England, that brought together a number of funders and community leaders to co-learn, be there on the ground. And so those types of things cannot happen if foundations intentionally don't have a culture of learning.
I also wanted to kind of add something when it comes to systems change. One of the key questions that I think we can ask ourselves that can change a lot is a question about accountability. So who are we accountable to? So that's a key question. So who are you accountable to? Are you accountable to your board? Are you accountable to the federal government? Are you accountable to the grantees? And my personal recommendation would be, I think it's probably all of this. The answer is all of this. But my personal recommendation would be spending more time thinking about how you're accountable to the beneficiaries, the people who are benefiting from the programs, right? The people in the grassroots, how collectively, all of us in the social sector, how we are accountable to them. And I think that's an extremely important question, especially in these times where people don't trust philanthropy anymore, right? So we have to make sure we think about that.
Thanks, Naolo. And I love that. I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier too about, doing this really well can also be an opportunity to relook at how we design the rules, right? And if we're going back to mission, our bylaws, as Ikem sort of discussed, and thinking about sort of our stakeholders, we can go back and think about those structures while we're doing that as well, which is fantastic. So, I mean, you spoke to an example of Definity Foundation, so some trust-based philanthropy in practice. And one of our questions actually coming up from the audience was related to examples. So I'm wondering if Ikem and Naola, you could share some examples. The question was really looking to see, are there funder examples you can share that are being done on a scale and scope that's really having quite a large impact. The individual's looking to see if there are funder examples or models that demonstrate really concretely examples of this practices that are being done. I don't know if either of you want to. I see Ikem, you unmuted first, so maybe I'll turn to you.
Yeah, I think this is something that it's a bit of an interest of mine, and I've been pushing it for a while now. Before joining the Rita Hall Foundation, I used to be at Ontario Trillium Foundation, um, pretty large grant maker nationally and provincially. And one of the things we found out pretty early was we say no way more than we say yes. This is typical of all funders. So you have this large constituency of people who you have said no to, who might be in varying levels of upset, disappointment, and could be, downright disappointed, not hostile to you because you promised that you were going to do all of these things in community. We've written you a magnificent application and you've just said no and sent us a form letter. So one of the things that we've been trying to do, and I have this conversation with all of my partners in various foundations, is to set up conversations with everybody we don't fund. Give them an opportunity to talk to you directly, talk to a person directly. We here at RHF, for one of our larger granting programs, Catapult Canada, we offer a 30-minute conversation with every project that we shortlist and decline. And the point of that is not at all to defend our decision, but to lay our cards on the table to say, hey, this is what you sent us, this is what we understood. Tell us what we got wrong. Tell us what you feel might not be working in our process, our timing. What did we miss? Separate from the merits or the value of your application, but how did we get it wrong? If we didn't get it wrong, we can, let us know. And also an opportunity for us to say very clearly, your application was great. We just didn't have enough money to get to it. So don't tinker with it. Send it right back. We in our last granting call, we received over 750 applications, $88 million in a request. We had $4 million to grant, and we ended up making about 28 grants. So that's about 720 people, organizations with communities behind them, with beneficiaries behind them, that we need to have a conversation with in some way to share this information with. Imagine this a sector where every funder has the capacity, the skill set, the openness, the humility, the courage, and is willing to take the risk to have those conversations with every grant call. That, I think, shifts this a little bit from a transactional experience of writing an application and getting a yes or no to in a long-term relationship, and to the conversation I'm having with Navarre in the chat. The grant, and I say this with and a bit cheekily, the grant making aspect of what we do is, to me, actually the least interesting part. It's the relationship that supersedes the grant, that lasts longer than the grant. I get it. It's rich for me to say that because I work on the granting side of things. I'm not writing the applications. But imagine where you have a 10-year, 20-year relationship with a funder. Every now and then you get a grant from them, you do some interesting work. Every now and then you give them some advice about how to change their funding practices and their relationships. I think that starts to move this into a longer-term trust-based relationship than a transactional grant-to-grant application cycle to application cycle interaction.
No, thanks, Ikem. I think that was a wonderful way to close us off because I see, unfortunately, we're at the hour. That just flew by. I know we could keep talking probably for another hour or two. But I just want to give a big thank you, though, to our three wonderful panelists. I'm sure everyone found something to take away. I was moderating, and yet I have a notebook full of quotes and inspiration and things to look up after the fact. So again, Naolo, Ikem, and Emmanuel. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I also just want to thank every member of the audience who stayed and listened from start to finish, as well as those that shared their thoughts and questions in the chat box. I apologize we couldn't get to all of them before the time ended. I also want to give a big thank you to Chantel Edwards, who is behind the scenes organizing this event from start to finish. So we will be sending out a recording by email soon with resources to learn more about this issue as well. We invite you to share the YouTube link with your peers if you found the insights valuable today. And in the meantime, we're wishing you all a really joy-filled and restful holiday break, however you're spending it with family and friends in the weeks to come. So thank you so much. And I see lots of also well wishes and thank yous in the chat as well for our wonderful panelists today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.